On behalf of the School of Physical Sciences in the Division of Natural Sciences at the University of Kent, we welcome everybody here today. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Martin as our speaker today. Not only because I know him as a distinguished scientist, but I think he's probably known me since I was really quite small, because he knew my father quite well. And I hate to think when he probably saw me running around the Royal Society or something when I was a younger child. Martin is one of the most distinguished scientists in the United Kingdom at this time. He is our Astronomer Royal. He is a distinguished professor in Cambridge. He was a former Master of Trinity College. And he is also a member of the House of Lords, as well as being a former president of the Royal Society. His seminal work that he has done in the field of space exploration, particularly black holes and galaxy formation, are extremely well known in the field. But not only has he done that, but he has been one of the pioneers in the last 20 or 30 years about supporting public engagement and bringing science of really quite complicated things to the general public. He's, as you are, I'm sure, going to find out in the next 45 minutes, an extremely able speaker in bringing complex things to explain to us. I never really understand cosmology, Martin, so I hope I'll try and learn something for you the next time. But I have heard him speak on some things, and particularly, for example, some wonderful lectures on the ideas of origins of life and whether that is life is out there, one of the great questions. So as I say, it's a great personal pleasure to introduce you, Martin, and thank you ever so much for taking the time to talk to us. You're going to be talking to us on a subject based on your book, available in all good bookshops, I'm sure. Unfortunately, you're not here to sign any copies, but I hope I'll persuade you to send me a few prizes later. And we have a debate afterwards, and we will, very much hope that all the panel members have an opportunity to answer questions from the audience. So Martin, once again, thank you very much. I'm greatly looking forward to your talk, and I hand over the floor to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's great to be here. I think I should start off with an apology, because although I have the title Astronomer Royal, I have to explain to some people that I'm not an astrologer, I'm just an astronomer, and I have no crystal ball. So it's rather bold of me to have written a book which is called On the Future, because most scientists are fairly rotten predictors, almost as bad as economists, but not quite. But what I'm going to do is to present some of these themes. And the main theme of my book is this, that this century is special. It's the first in the 45 million centuries of the Earth's existence where the main threats come from nature. Sorry, come not from nature, but from one species, ours. And the long-term future of the entire planet is in the hands of humanity. And I am going to start off with two things where we can predict, even with a cloudy crystal ball. The world is going to be more crowded in 2050, and the world is going to be hotter in 2050. So first, a word about population trends. 50 years ago, the world population was about 3.5 billion. It's now about 7.7 billion. It's more than double what it was then. And the growth's been mainly in Asia and Africa. This distorted graph, due to Danny Dorling, scales each region by the population growth in that region in the last 30 years. And the main point is it's in Southeast Asia, India and China, and in Africa that the growth has been concentrated. But the growth is slowing. The number of births per year worldwide actually peaked a few years ago and is going down. Nonetheless, world population is still destined to rise to about 9 billion by 2050. That's partly because most people in the developing world are still young. They're yet to have children and they live longer. And the age histogram in the developing world, like West Africa on the left, will become more like that in Western Europe on the right. The younger people, with dominance, they will grow and not die early. But despite doom-laden forecasts of made in the 1960s, food production in the last 50 years has, through the Green Revolution, etc., kept pace with rising population. Famines still occur, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not to overall food scarcity. To feed 9 billion by mid-century is going to require more advances in agriculture, low-till, water conserving, and GM crops, especially if you want to avoid encroaching too much on forests, etc. And also maybe changing our diet, converting insects, highly nutritious and rich in proteins, into palatable food, and eating artificial meat, certainly not as much beef as present-day Americans eat. But to quote Gandhi, there's enough for everyone's need, if not for everyone's greed. Projections of population beyond 2050 are uncertain. It's not even clear if there'll be a continuing rise or fall globally. Falling infant mortality, urbanization, and women's education trigger the demographic transition towards lower birth rates. But there could be countervailing cultural influences. If, for whatever reason, families in Africa stay large, then according to the UN, that country's population could double again between 2050 and 2100, from 2 billion to 4 billion. Then the world population would be 11 billion altogether, and Nigeria would have almost as big a population as Europe and North America combined. Well, optimists say that each extra mouth brings 2 hands and a brain. But it's the geopolitical stresses that are most worrying. As compared to the fatalism of earlier generations, those in poor countries now know, via the internet, etc., what they're missing. And migration is easier. It's a real portent for disaffection and instability. Multiple megaversions of the tragic boat people crossing the Mediterranean today. So wealthy nations, especially those in Europe, should urgently promote growing prosperity in Africa, and not just for altruistic reasons. We need a mega Marshall Plan for Africa. And another thing, if humanity's collective impact on land use and climate pushes too hard, then the resultant ecological shock could irreversibly impoverish our biosphere. Extinction rates are rising. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it. Already there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Preserving biodiversity is crucial, though, for human well-being. But for many environmentalists, preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above what it means to us humans. To quote the great Harvard ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. So the world's getting more crowded. And there's a second firm prediction, which is it'll gradually get warmer. In contrast to population issues, climate change is certainly not under-discussed, although it is still underacted upon. The basic datum is this, the famous Keeling curve, which shows the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere over the last 50 years, which has risen by about 50%. The oscillations are seasonal there because there are more trees in the northern hemisphere than in the south. So when the trees lose their leaves in the northern autumn, CO2 goes up, but that CO2 is taken up again by trees in the spring. But the main point is rise, And we all know, and it's been known since the 19th century, that CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and this rise in itself causes warming. But there are uncertainties because of the feedback effects. If the atmosphere gets warmer, it changes water vapor, cloud cover, and all the rest. And so there are a lot of uncertainties in the amount of warming that we can expect for different scenarios. But despite the uncertainties, there's one message that most would agree on. Yes, here are various scenarios for different assumptions about fossil fuel use, etc. And in the bars at the right, it shows the uncertainty in each model due simply to not knowing the right physics for clouds, etc. But the main point is, despite the uncertainties, under business as usual scenarios, we can't rule out later this century really catastrophic warming and tipping points triggering long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's ice cap. But even those who agree that there's a significant risk of climate catastrophe a century hence, they differ in how urgently they advocate action today. These divergences stem from differences in economics and ethics, in particular in how much obligation we should feel towards future generations, the long-term discount rate, in other words, and also in optimism about technological fixes. Above all, it depends on an ethical question. In optimizing people's life chances, should we, as it were, discriminate on grounds of date of birth? Politicians won't prioritize issues when the benefits accrue mainly in distant parts of the world and decades into the future, unless there's public pressure, unless they know the public's behind them. They care about what's in the press and what's in their inboxes. Otherwise, they won't prioritize these issues. And that's why, incidentally, it's important for us to do two things. First, to encourage demonstrations by the young, because they will be alive at the end of a century, and their views should count more than the rest of ours. And secondly, to take advantage of charismatic individuals who can have more voice than scientists have unaided. Just two examples, the papal encyclical in 2015, Laudato Si, had a huge impact on his billion followers in Latin America, Africa, and East Asia, and eased the path towards consensus at the December 2015 climate conference. And our secular Pope David Attenborough's TV programs have been influential too. I don't believe that Michael Gove would have invested any of his political capital in legislation against non-reusable plastics had it not been for David Attenborough's Blue Planet 2, especially the pictures showing an albatross returning to his nest and coughing up for its young, not the longed for food of bits of plastic. That's an iconic image, rather like the polar bear and the melting ice flow is for the climate impact. And so we've got to encourage these iconic symbols which will persuade voters about the importance of the issue, and they, along with young people, will then persuade politicians that they can do this without losing votes. But if we focus more on the issues of going to net zero by 2050, there is, I think, a win-win situation, especially for the UK. Nations like the UK should accelerate R&D into all forms of low carbon energy generation and into other technologies where we need parallel progress. Storage, batteries, compressed air, hydrogen, etc., and smart grids. The faster these clean technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so they become affordable to, for instance, India, where more generator capacity is needed, where the health of the poor is jeopardized by smoky stoves burning wood or dung, and where there'd be otherwise pressure to build coal-fired power stations. And for this country, I think this is especially important because even if we meet our targets, that reduce its global emissions by about 1.5%. That's our present emissions. Whereas if we can help India, which potentially emits more than 10% of the world's CO2, if we can help them just a bit, we can make more difference than we can ourselves and help to equalize the world. So we should develop these things not just for our own use, but as an aid to speeding up the development which will happen in the poorer parts of the world. And I won't go into details, but we obviously need things like long-range DC grids and maybe nuclear. That's controversial, but a long-range DC grid going north to south, from the sunny south to the north, and east-west, maybe all along the Belt and Road to China to smooth over peak demands in different time zones. This is the kind of thing we should aim for in the long run. And it would be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than devising clean and economical energy for the entire world. But if other measures fail, and we can't depend on clean energy, then of course there is a plan B, which is geoengineering. This is to do one of two things, to reduce the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth by putting aerosols in the upper atmosphere or mirrors in space. That's one thing, or to extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or from the output of power stations. These are techniques which are in principle feasible, but I think most of us think they're undesirable and they're very much a second best if we can't cut CO2 emissions below dangerous or threatening levels without them. Well, so much for the global trends in climate and environment. Let me now turn to the other consequences of fast developing technology. We should be evangelists for new technology, not Luddites. Without it, the world can't provide the food and sustainable energy for the expanding and more demanding population we're going to have by 2050. However, many of us are anxious that it's advancing so fast, we may not properly control the way technology develops. And that'll give us a bumpy ride through this century. And my book expands on these concerns. We're ever more dependent on elaborate networks, electric grids, air traffic control, international finance, just-in-time delivery, and so forth. But unless these globalized networks are highly resilient, their benefits could be outweighed by catastrophic, albeit rare, breakdowns, real-world analogues of what happened in 2008 to the financial system, and of course to what we're seeing in the COVID-19 pandemic. Our cities will be paralyzed without electricity, supermarket shelves would be empty within days if supply chains were disrupted. So we need more resilience and to minimize the risk of these global tragedies. Where pandemics are, of course, at the far front of our concerns today. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics, they've been crucial, of course, in offering prospects of containing future pandemics. But the same research does have downsides. This is the influenza virus. And back in 2011, two groups, one in Wisconsin, another in Holland, showed it was surprisingly easy to modify the flu virus to make it more virulent and more transmissible. To some extent, this was a scary portent of things to come. The COVID-19 virus is more complicated, but I gather we can't rule out scenarios where that can be engineered as well. So we have the threat of engineered pandemics as well as real ones. And the new CRISPR-Cas9 technique for gene editing is hugely promising. But again, there are ethical concerns about, for instance, the Chinese experiments on human embryos. And also there are worries about runaway consequences of so-called gene drive programs, where you try to make a species you don't want sterile. This has been used to try and wipe out the mosquito that carries the Zika virus in South America, but some nasty people want to use it to wipe out the grey squirrel by making that sterile. But of course, there's a risk of some ecological runaway if one attempts to tinker with the ecological balance in this way. And more generally, thinking of those examples I've given, it's clear that regulation of biotech is needed. But the worry is, for me, that whatever regulations are imposed on prudential or ethical grounds, after consulting academies and all the wise people, can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that's a nightmare, because whereas an atomic bomb can't be built without large-scale special purpose facilities, biotech involves small-scale dual-use equipment. Indeed, biohacking is burgeoning, even as a hobby and competitive game. We know all too well that technical expertise doesn't guarantee balanced rationality. The global village will have its village idiots, and they will have global range. The rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups by bio as well as cyber technology will pose an intractable challenge to governments, and it'll aggravate the tension between three things: privacy, security, and liberty. And these concerns are fairly near term, the next 10 or 15 years. What about 2050 and beyond? On the bio front, we might then expect two things. First, a better understanding of the combination of genes that determine key human characteristics. And secondly, the ability to synthesize genomes that match these features. The great physicist Freeman Dyson conjectured a time when children will be able to design and create new organisms, just as his generation played with chemistry sets when they were young. But if it becomes possible to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, our ecology and even our species may not live long unscathed. And what about another transformative technology, robotics and AI? There have been exciting advances in machine learning. I think everyone knows that DeepMind's AlphaGo Zero computer famously achieved world championship levels in the games of Go and chess in just a few hours. It was given just the rules and learned by playing against itself over and over again. Its processing speed allows it to play several games per second. And it is, of course, the speed of computers increasing with time which allows them to succeed by brute force methods. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images, not the way babies learn. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of multilingual text. In Europe, they're given EU documents. Their boredom threshold is infinite. But the implications of all this for our society are already ambivalent. If we are sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for surgery, or even given a poor credit rating, we'd expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. If these decisions were entirely delegated to an algorithm, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if presented with compelling evidence that on average, the machines make better decisions than the humans they've usurped. There may be rare, unpredicted bugs. But AI systems will almost certainly become more intrusive and pervasive. Records of all our movements and our health and our financial transactions will be in the cloud, managed by a multinational quasi-monopoly. The data may be used benignly, for instance, for medical research, or to warn us of incipient health risks, but its availability to internet companies is already shifting the balance of power from governments to globe-spanning conglomerates. And also the arms race between cyber criminals and those trying to defend against them will become still more expensive and vexatious as each is equipped with AI. So many experts think that AI, like synthetic biology, already needs guidelines for responsible innovation. Tensions are already emerging when AI moves from the research phase to being a potentially massive money spinner for global companies. The ethics may then go by the board. But machines are still lagging behind in some ways. They're clumsy compared to children in sensing and interacting with the real world, even moving pieces on a real chessboard. But they're improving. This robot from Boston Dynamics can apparently do somersaults. And the incipient nature of work is going to change, and how this is going to happen will depend on robots, and there are many excellent books by economists and social scientists on the impact. Clearly, machines are going to take over much of manufacturing and retail distribution, and they can supplement, if not replace, many white-collar jobs, routine legal work, accountancy, computer coding, medical diagnostics, and even surgery. Many professionals will find their hard-earned skills in less demand, though they're needed probably to complement what the machine is doing. But in contrast, some skilled service sector jobs, plumbing and gardening, for instance, require non-routine interactions with the external world, and they'll be among the hardest to automate. But the digital revolution will surely generate enormous wealth for innovators and global companies. And preserving a healthy society will surely require redistribution of that wealth. Indeed, I think governments are going to need to raise taxes vastly to enhance the number and status of those who care for the old, the young, and the sick. There are currently far too few of these people. They're poorly paid, inadequately esteemed, and insecure in their positions. Their work is far more fulfilling than working call centers or Amazon warehouses. So if those now working in the latter can be re-employed in more humane work, that is a win-win situation. And I can see this happening in Scandinavia. There may be ideological barriers to sufficiently high tax rates here. And there'll be other privacy concerns. Are you happy if a random stranger sitting near you in a restaurant or on public transport can, via facial recognition, identify you and invade your privacy? Or if fake videos of you become so convincing that video evidence is no longer compelling? Computers succeed by reinforced learning on big training sets. But learning about human behavior involves observing actual people in real homes or workplaces. And the machine doing this would feel sensorily deprived by the slowness of real life. It's like watching trees grow is for us. And to quote Stuart Russell, a leading AI theorist at Berkeley, the machine could try all kinds of things: scrambling eggs, stacking wooden blocks, chewing wires, picking its finger into electric outlets, but nothing will produce a strong enough feedback loop to convince the computer it was on the right track and lead it to the next necessary action to understand human beings. So it's going to be very hard to instill common sense into robots. And another thing, the Go playing computer used hundreds of kilowatts of power. But the brain of this chap, who was the defeated human challenger in Go, he uses about 30 watts, like a small light bulb, and can do many other things apart from play Go. So there's a long way to go there. But let's look still further ahead. How human will these machines and robots be? AI can cope with complex, fast-changing networks, traffic flow, electric grids. The Chinese could have an efficient planned economy that Marx could only dream of. And it could help science too. Perhaps it can find the recipe for a high-temperature superconductor. It can do proton folding problems, and perhaps decide whether string theory can really describe our universe. Those would be good. What if a machine develops a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or go rogue? The popular culture, of course, displays a dark side where the AI gets out of its box, infiltrates the internet, and pursues goals misaligned with human interest. Some AI pundits take this seriously, and they think the field already needs guidelines like biotech. But others, like for instance Rodney Brooks, the inventor of the Baxter robot, regard these concerns as premature. He thinks it will be a long time before artificial intelligence will worry us more than real stupidity does. But be it as it may, it's likely that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether they'll be idiot savants or display superhuman capabilities. This man, this futurologist Ray Kurzweil, who works at Google, he argues that once machines had surpassed human capabilities, they could themselves design and assemble a new generation of even more powerful ones. An intelligence explosion. He wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines. He predicts that humans can transcend biology by merging with computers. In old style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. This leads to all kinds of philosophical conundrums of personal identity. Would it still be you? But these academic problems of philosophers may become practical ethics in coming centuries. Kurzweil, incidentally, is worried that his nirvana may not happen in his lifetime. So he wants his body frozen until that time's reached. And there is a company in Arizona that will freeze and store your body, replacing your blood with liquid nitrogen, and revive you, so they say, when immortality is on offer, and you can be resurrected with your brain downloaded. And I was surprised to find that 3 academics here in England have gone into this cryonics. 2 have paid the full whack, a third the cut price for just having his head frozen. I was glad to tell them that I would rather be in an English churchyard than an American refrigerator when I die. And I was also glad to say that these people are from Oxford, not from my own university. But just to think of one futuristic scenario, it's at least on the cards that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may become malleable through the deployment of genetic modification and cyborg technologies. Moreover, this future evolution, a kind of secular intelligent design, would take only centuries, in contrast with the thousands of centuries needed for Darwinian evolution. And this is a game changer, because when we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a time gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their artifacts. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few hundred years from now will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have some algorithmic understanding of how we behaved. And now let me turn briefly to another technology, my favorite one, space. Because it's beyond our Earth in environments hostile to humans that cyborg and AI technology may have the most spectacular scope, where the changes I've mentioned could happen fastest and should worry us less. So just a quick tour. During this century, the whole solar system will be explored by swarms of miniaturized probes, far more advanced than the wonderful Cassini, which spent 13 years exploring Saturn and its moons, or the robot, which landed on a comet with a little robot like that, or the NASA probe that transmitted these pictures back from Pluto, about 12,000 times further away than the moon. These 3 instruments were all designed in the 1990s. And then they were built and had to spend about 10 years on their journey. Think how technology of smartphones has improved in those 20 years, and think therefore how much better we could do now with these unmanned robotic probes going out to the outer solar system. And the next step will be deployment in space of robotic fabricators who can build large structures, giant telescopes in space, solar energy collectors and such like. What about manned space flight? The practical case for this, in my view, gets ever weaker as robots get better. So will it have a resurgence? It's over 50 years since Neil Armstrong's one small step, and I cherish this picture signed for me by 7 of the Apollo astronauts a few years ago. Of course, in the 1960s, there was a space race against the Russians. NASA got about 4% of the federal budget. Had that pace continued, there would have been footprints on Mars long before today. But once the race to the moon was won, there was no motivation for continuing the huge expenditure. NASA gets now 0.6% of the US federal budget. And although hundreds of others have been into space subsequently, anticlimactically, they've only been in low Earth orbit, mainly in the International Space Station. So will there be any inspirational Apollo-style projects in future? Well, there's no denying that Curiosity, which has been trundling across the moon's surface, across Mars's surface for the last 10 years, and its successor Perseverance, which got there last week, will be doing the same thing. They may miss startling discoveries that no human geologist could make. But as robots and AI get better, the gap will close, but the difference in expenditure between sending a robot and sending a person safely and bringing them back remains huge. The space shuttle failed twice in 135 launches, less than 2% failure rate. But for the American taxpayers, each of those failures was traumatic. They expected greater safety than that. And I think that's going to be too expensive. So my expectation is that because of this safety culture, NASA will confront political obstacles in achieving any grand goals in space within a feasible budget. So I think, possibly leaving aside the Chinese, that the future of manned spaceflight lies with privately funded adventurers prepared to participate in a cut price program far riskier than Western nations could impose on publicly supported civilians. So Elon Musk's SpaceX, Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin will soon offer orbital flights to paying customers, accepting higher risks. And were I an American, I would only support NASA's unmanned program. I'd argue that private enterprise ventures should front all manned missions as cut-price, high-risk projects. And with many volunteers, some perhaps even accepting one-way tickets, driven by the same motives as early explorers, mountaineers, and the like. And Elon Musk himself has said that he would like to die on Mars, not on impact. And he's now only 49, I think, so he might make this 40 years from now. And good luck to him and those others. But don't ever expect mass emigration from the Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. And here I disagree with Musk and with my late colleague Stephen Hawking. I think it's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change on Earth is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, we should cheer on these brave space adventurers because they will have a pivotal role in spearheading the post-human future. They'll be the ones who evolve using genetic modification, etc., into a new species. And if they become eventually entirely electronic, then they won't want to stay on a planet at all. They may be near immortal, so they will go off into deep space. Well, just got 5 more minutes, so let me conclude with a few more questions. When I talk about this subject, what I'm always asked is there life out there already? Is the galaxy waiting for our post-human progeny to spread through it? My answer is you don't know. Of course, there's some people who do know, and I get letters from these people, and I respond to these letters by saying, well, do you really think that if these aliens have made the effort to traverse interstellar space, visit us, they just make a corn circle, meet one or two well-known cranks, and then go away again. Seems unlikely. And I tell these people to write to each other and not to me. There may be aliens out there, but I think we just don't know at the moment. But let's ask what we do know about life in space. We don't know if there were Martians, as I said. On the red planet Mars, as we know, Perseverance is going to look under the surface, and the ESO probe that's going in 2 years will look down to a depth of 6 feet under the surface for any evidence for freeze-dried bacteria, as it were, from the time when there was more water on Mars than there is now. We don't know about that. And under the ice of Enceladus, this is a moon of Saturn, there may be something alive, we just don't know. But perspective changes when we look beyond our solar system to the realm of the stars. We now know that there are planets orbiting most of the stars in the galaxy. And this is a huge development in making our night sky far more interesting. Many are detected in this simple way. If you look at a star, then if a planet transits across in front of it, the star gets a bit fainter once per orbit, and the amount of it gets fainter tells you how big the planet is. This is a standard technique, and the Kepler mission looked at hundreds of thousands of stars and measured their brightness very precisely and came up with thousands of planets. And this rather silly diagram in the bottom left is a depiction of some of these systems it found, scaled by the size of the planets and the length of their year. But the main point we've learned is that almost every star has planets around it, and about 1 star in every 6 has an Earth-like planet. So do these planets have life on them? They're habitable, but does that mean that they're inhabited? We don't know. We might know more if we'd actually see them, rather than just see their indirect effect on their star. And what will help in this context is this telescope. This is the European Southern Observatory's telescope, rather unimaginatively named the Extremely Large Telescope. It's being built in Chile. It's got a mirror 39 meters across, a mosaic of 800 sheets of glass, and its high resolution spectrograph will be able to separate out the light from a planet orbiting a star from the star itself, looking for evidence of oxygen and of vegetation, hemoglobin, from spectral features. So we might, within 10 or 20 years, have evidence for an Earth-like planet which has evidence for vegetation on it. Looking for intelligent aliens is more of a gamble, and I wouldn't be so confident about that. But this is something which we haven't, and we can learn also about the topography of the planets, just as aliens looking at the Earth would see it as a pale blue dot, looking slightly different in color depending on whether the Pacific Ocean or the landmass of Asia was facing them. So we can start learning about planets from the time we have telescopes like this in orbit. Well, let me say just a few words about an astronomical perspective. I'm sort of asked, do astronomers bring any special perspective to these topics? And I'd like to make the point that they are aware more than most of the long-term future. This is a time chart familiar to everyone, unless you live in Kentucky or parts of the Muslim world, showing the time for various key stages in the emergence and evolution of life over the last 4 billion years or so. But most people who know this somehow tend to feel we humans are towards the end of a story. It's the culmination of it all. But no astronomer can believe that, because one thing we do know is that the sun is less than halfway through its life. It's been shining for 4.5 billion years, but it's about 6 more billion before it looks like this, running out of fuel, blowing off its outer layers, leaving the inside to become like a white dwarf. And the expanding universe may go on forever. To quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So the time for future evolution is vastly longer, the time on Earth or far beyond the Earth, than the times elapsed up to now. Moreover, the future evolution could take place much faster if it's, as it were, intelligently directed than the Darwinian process was. So we have no idea of what futures might occur elsewhere, nor what might already have occurred far away. This is rather nice. Let me just show you this movie, which shows what happens if two galaxies collide. This is a simulation, and you get a train wreck, and two disk galaxies become a single amorphous elliptical. And I show this as a warning because this will happen to us and Andromeda in about 4 billion years before the sun dies. The Milky Way will disappear due to this process, and we find ourselves in a different kind of more dispersed gas. So just to conclude, I'll miss out the multiverse, which makes some people foam at the mouth. Perhaps that's a good thing to do, but let me just conclude by saying that even in the perspective stretching 45 million centuries into the past, even more into the future, this century is special, which is one which determines whether we foreclose the amazing future or whether we can cope with it and cope with the effects of climate change and all the rest, and misuse of powerful technology. And we will learn in the next century or two more about how widespread life is, and we'll also know more about our universe. And is our Big Bang the only one? Is physical reality even bigger than we think? All these ideas will be understood better, as well as the origin of life. And just one final point about the origin of life: even though we understand the evolution of life, we don't understand the origin because we don't know what changed between just complex chemistry and the first metabolizing, reproducing structures that we call alive. It could have been a rare fluke which only happened on the Earth, could have happened in billions of places. And that, incidentally, is why it's very important to look for life in the ocean under the ice of Enceladus or Europa, because if we could find life in a second place in our solar system, then it couldn't be a rare fluke, and it must then exist in billions of places in our galaxy, where so long as we know that it only definitely exists here on Earth, we can't rule out us being unique. So we would lose our cosmic modesty if we find elsewhere, but find ourselves in a vastly more interesting environment. And so just to finish with, my message is that we are able to provide a good life if we direct technology properly, but we need to focus on the downsides if we are to avoid causing problems. And the problem is we need to think on the timescale of a century, which is an instant in cosmic perspectives, but an eternity for politicians. And that's the problem for us in this generation, especially the younger people. So I've gone on too long, so thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. I'm aware that there's hundreds of people listening to this who cannot clap hands, but I suggest we, the members of the panel, can thank you for your very, very exciting, sweeping, and also very clear talk.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so clearly you fired the intellect of people, because there's many, many questions, more than we could possibly hope you to answer, but given the time available. So if that's all right, I'll ask you a couple, and then we can take a little break and come back for the roundtable discussion. Then I'll introduce the panelists to the audience, and we can discuss a bit more. But one that has, there's a couple of questions that have, 3 questions that have received more votes from the audience than the others. So I suggest we maybe try to address those now. So one of them is actually cites a a bit of science fiction, is how likely do you think it is that attempts at geoengineering might drastically backfire and create a crisis bigger than the one they are trying to fix?
Yes, well, it's possible, and that's why we should be very careful. And the kind of geoengineering which involves putting stuff in the upper atmosphere, I think shouldn't be attempted until we've done lots of experiments, till we understand clouds better, and until we know what the regional impact would be. And we've got to bear in mind that different countries would want to turn down the thermostat differently, so it'll be controversial. So I think it'd be very unfortunate if we're led to that kind of geoengineering. The kind which is benign is the kind where you extract CO2 either from the power stations that emit it or directly from the atmosphere and simply undo the excess emission that we've caused. Those are feasible and I think harmless, but they're very expensive and I think politically rather unfeasible. So I think we should make sure that we don't really need to embark on any of these. But if we do need to, then it is physically possible to actually suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere.
Thank you. That question came from Sophie, by the way. And there's another question that has received lots of votes from my colleague Sam Carr. He's pointing out that a lot of the technological progress that we've made in recent decades is based basically on the same materials that, so for example, all the electronics is based on silicon, which was, and the transistor, which was invented 70 years ago. So somehow the materials that we make things with haven't changed. It's the technologies that we build with them that has been advancing. So his question is whether you think this will continue or future technologies may be based on radically new materials.
Yes. Well, let me give two very different examples. One is the idea that you can make skyscrapers out of wood by having a sort of well, another kind of plywood, which is strong enough for that. That would be a benign technology. So that's one. I can't think of a second is that if we could have superconductivity at room temperature, then that would greatly ease the production of very long-range energy transmission by power lines. At the moment, the only way you can get superconductivity at that temperature is by squeezing something to very, very high pressure, which is not feasible. But the discovery of a high temperature superconductor would be something that would transform the world's energy supplies, because it would then be feasible to have worldwide transmission of energy and make much better use of renewables, etc. So I think we should hope that will happen.
And bear in mind that we are overrunning a little bit, but just to put to you one final question before we have the roundtable discussion. There's a question from Pete Knowles. As recent events have shown, events out of our control could mean that we're only one catastrophe away from extinction. And his question is, why not putting more effort into living Earth as well as protecting it from the point of view of guaranteeing the continuation of the species? I think you've addressed this partly, but...
Well, I don't recommend leaving the planet. It would be worse than living at the bottom of the ocean or something. But what I do recommend, and I think everyone would feel is important, is more preparedness for catastrophes like the one we had, and more resilience, so we don't depend so much on single supply chains, etc., where one link can disrupt motor manufacturing or something like that. So I think we've learned, and we need more spare beds in hospitals like the Germans have and we don't, etc. So we can make things much more resilient. But still, I think there's a lot to worry about, because of course, the present pandemic would have been far worse in its impacts had it happened 10 or 20 years ago, before we had a globally pervasive internet. And let's think how much worse things would be if the internet failed, or if the electricity failed in the whole part of the UK. And all these things could happen, and indeed they could happen by malign cyber attacks. And so I'm very worried that a cascading problem could indeed lead to an almost irreversible collapse of our civilization. Things will be far worse than what we've had. Pandemic could be more virulent, and if it was combined with loss of electric power and all that goes with it, then that could be something which leads to anarchy from which is very hard to emerge.
Now we are for a second part of this event where we'll have a discussion with our panel of experts. So let me introduce them to you. Apart from our speaker, they are all colleagues of mine at the University of Kent, excuse me. Maria Alfredson is a reader in theoretical materials. Robert Barker is a senior lecturer in chemistry and forensic science. Charlie Gardner is a lecturer in conservation science. Nigel Mason, I already introduced, he's a professor in molecular physics. Jennifer Tullett is a senior lecturer in biogerontology. And Philippe de Wilde is a professor of natural sciences. So fortunately or unfortunately, we have many, many more questions that we will be able to address. So I will try to address to the panel some of them, and maybe we can have a debate. And later on, we will send an email to everyone who participated in an email with a list of questions we couldn't get to as a kind of food for further thought. So let me start with Philippe. There's a question from Wayne Griff, which I think maybe you'd like to say something about. So Wayne said, whilst regulation of some areas, such as biotech and artificial intelligence, is clearly necessary, is the greater risk not some excuse me, some unforeseen interaction between new technologies as the pace and complexity of development accelerates? How can we best identify and mitigate that risk?
I think some of these interactions were actually mentioned in the talk. For example, the use of artificial intelligence to understand protein folding. That's a major example, which can have very positive benefits. It can help in designing medicine, for example. At the same time, of course, you could have a collision of artificial intelligence and somebody who is looking for which is the most dangerous mutation of the COVID virus, and then tries to genetically engineer a really dangerous version of COVID. So I think as a humanity, we are constantly on a knife edge, and we can use this collision of technology or this interaction of technologies for the benefit of humankind, or also to its detriment. But looking at collision of technology that could lead to disaster, I'm also worried about the collision of artificial intelligence and politics, really. We also need to look at how that is evolving. For example, in China, and the Chinese government has different views on the use of artificial intelligence than many governments in the West. So there's a danger for collision. It can also have benefits, for example, in biotechnology. And let's not forget about politics.
Somehow what drew my attention to that question too is very non-trivial, because the way we are used to assessing technologies is through the some committee that looks into a new drug and decides whether it's effective or not. So you always look at the specific technology, and to some extent you assess it in isolation. So there may be a very good point that there might be collective effects that are completely unforeseeable.
We need open dialogue, and I think as many members of the general public need to be involved in elaborating ethical principles of where we can go in combining AI with biotechnology or with other technologies. This has to be discussed openly and democratically. That's the only way that would make me feel safe about AI.
Right.
That's something that struck me, if you don't mind me jumping in, while I was listening to the talk, was
Please.
that, and it follows on from what you were saying, Philippe, is that it's almost a career path in itself to have an overview of all of these things. Because the way you're discussing it, Martin, and the overview of all of these topics, we don't teach that really at university. We're teaching all these individual parts of it. And what it needs is actually people that are thinking about it and joining it up and able to talk to all the experts in the individual fields and actually have a, you know, national, international, global view of what is happening. And I think maybe that's something that needs to come, you know, because then we could really harness all the expertise that we do have.
Sure. Jennifer, from this autumn, I will be teaching ethics to bioscience master students.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I teach it in my aging module, and it's so important. But more than that, I mean, maybe biologists need to understand more about space and more about the, you know, all of it. Like I say, almost a completely separate career path is to understand the whole, the overview of everything, really, and the politics of it.
Could I comment on that? I thought one of the things that Martin, key points put in your talk, Martin, was cooperation versus competition. And I think this is kind of essential. We have to change the way, I mean, evolution, if you like, in the way of human behavior and the competitiveness of human behavior is also a very important part of the process. I mean, we like to think that we are scientific, logical, rational, and making those decisions. But we know when the order breaks down, including in Europe more recently in, say, Yugoslavia and so on, war and competition first come. So there has to be some kind of change, I think, in the way that we work together as a society. And I wonder how you reflect on that. And maybe that was what was behind your competition versus collaboration. I mean, we all watch Star Trek, where, you know, somehow everybody is now one planet and we all work together. But do you think that's viable in the next 30, 40, 50 years?
Can I respond? Yes. Well, I think
Of
yes.
course, yes.
And of course, to deal with Professor Mason's point, of course, the scientific community is unusually successful in straddling boundaries of faith and nation, and we've seen this to some extent in the pandemic. But I agree with what's been said, and particularly about the need to have this broad perspective on the way risk can cascade. I mean, I mentioned, you know, if some failure of the electric grid, that cascades everywhere. And of course, the pandemic is already doing so. And of course, to follow up what was said, in retrospect, it would have been worth spending huge amounts by normal standards in scenarios which allowed us to be better prepared for this pandemic, because the pandemic is going to cost the world some figure estimated at, say, $20 trillion worldwide over the next 5 years. And so in that perspective, it would be worth paying an insurance premium of hundreds of billions of dollars, assuming that it's an effect that's going to happen once every few decades, in order to be prepared. And we didn't. And I think one lesson we can learn from all these disasters is that if we are prepared and have some structure set up to cope, then there'll be a lot less catastrophic than it would be.
I note that a lot of the questions we've been getting, they are asking us to make a prediction. So, for example, what we just discussed about competition versus cooperation, Henry S. asked about that. And his question was actually, will this be the century of competition or cooperation? But actually, we are more stating, well, we're for cooperation. But it's very hard to answer these questions. And partly that's because there may be questions about what we want to do. The human species will do what it wants to do. And would you agree with that? Or do you think there are forces that, things that are completely impossible to resist that take us in a particular direction? By the way, this is a question for anyone in the panel.
So, can I answer?
Sure.
Can I make a quick comment, which is that I think one thing we've learned from COVID is that no one's safe until everyone's safe. So clearly there we do need cooperation over the vaccine. But I think on another example, which I quoted briefly, is that not only do we want to minimize inequality within countries, but between countries. And I think if I can expand slightly on what I said about Africa, if Africa's development lags behind, then it would become sort of embittered and really will cause huge failures of welfare, etc. And the problem of Africa is that firstly, they know what they're missing, so they're not going to be resigned to being worse off than others, but also some of the ladders have been kicked away. The East Asian countries were able to advance their economies by manufacturing with workers on lower wages than in Europe and the United States. But that ladder has been kicked away because there's now so-called reshoring of manufacturing in rich countries because of robots. So we've got to help Africa in some way, or find ways in which they can use their natural resources to develop economically and narrow and not widen the gap. Because if the gap widens between different segments of the world, then given the growth of all kinds of weapons and other kinds of sub-warfare attacks that we can make via cyber, etc., we'll be in a dangerous world. So I think we've got to cooperate, otherwise we'll have a very unsettled world.
Can I come in on a comment on that? Because I
Please,
fully
go ahead.
agree. I think we absolutely have to collaborate. That is absolutely true. At the same time, I think a little bit of a healthy competition might help to drive the technology forward. And I think your example of the space race was, or the moon race, was one of the examples where we actually drove technology and materials by a competition. So maybe a healthy competition is useful as well. Just to put it on the top, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So
I
would you say
agree with
for
that. Sorry, Jorge.
go
I agree
ahead.
with that completely. I think a combination between kind of competition, but what we need to do, as Martin said very clearly in his talk, was you need to take everyone with you on that journey, right? And the strength of those visuals, the strength of those things you picked up, for example, David Attenborough changing the hearts and minds of an entire nation is an exact perfect example of that. I've often said it's not my area, but we should work on trying to make sure that David Attenborough lives forever in order to try and maintain some of that support for some of those things, because it's not freezing, but just keep on going and doing that. Because people like myself, I've been working for years looking at kind of sustainable materials, looking at that, learning from nature as part of those things. But in a moment, that changes everything. As you say, suddenly Michael Gove is putting money towards plastic packaging funding and things to replace that and trying to build that in. And suddenly we're able to look into that world and be inspired by nature, be worked by nature, but working in one with nature as opposed to kind of working against it and actually causing problems instead. So you have to take those visuals along with it, and that is absolutely, for me, is key. And then competition is important because, money unfortunately drives that in many ways, I think.
Yes. And to add one thing, I mentioned improved technology for zero carbon energy generation, and obviously, if nations compete to develop this, then those that do best will have the market in the developing world, and that would be good for the developing world and also for them. So that's why I think in this country we ought to prioritize that sort of effort, because it's an idea of where we can actually benefit from being clever and quick, rather than it being a burden on us to have to replace all our boilers and all these things, which are going to be very expensive, and people will be reluctant to spend money that way. So if we can spend money on things that look clever and new, and make use of the fact that we may be only 1.5% of the world's CO2 emissions, but we've been up to 10% of the world's clever ideas. Let's try and use these ideas to help not just ourselves, but the rest of the world. Then I think that'll be positive.
But I fully agree with
Charlie.
you. I think we have to share. We have to share it. And
Yes.
yes.
Yes, Charlie wanted to say something.
If I could just add, it's quite striking that whilst all the themes we're talking about are focused on the natural sciences and physical sciences and technology, when we've been asked to speculate about what's needed, all the answers we're giving are always coming down to social sciences. We're talking about governance of these technologies. We're talking about political and economic change. We're talking about cooperation or competition. And I think what's clear is that the answers are not to be found in technology. The answers come from, when trying to predict what the future will be like. The future will not be driven by technological change. The future will be determined by the decisions that we make as a society. And while, of course, all the panelists have expertise in the natural and physical sciences, we must prioritize social sciences to ensure that as a society, we end up making wise decisions.
Yes. Well, we can't get our ethics just from science, and there's some doors we could open, but should be best left closed. And those are sort of issues that we have to decide as citizens, not as scientists.
And I just come in there. We all work in a university, and Martin stressed that the decisions have to be made by the young. And universities are about education and working with the young people. So if we change and start to think at a university level, that although we are teaching the expertise that we do, we put it in this wider collaborative context. What you said, Rob, we should be doing that as part of our courses now. We should be preparing our next generation of students to be thinking in that way, not in a doctrinarial way, but that is the thing that we can do. And that is, we are in the universities, we have that unique opportunity to do that. And then, of course, we do the widening participation and we do the public engagement and so on as well. But we are working in the universities, and I think that is probably our greatest challenge of what we should do.
So there's very little time now, and there's a couple of questions that lots of people want us to debate. So let's move on to those. So Lord Dover is asking, what are your thoughts on nations, corporations, or even individuals claiming sovereignty over the moon, and quotes apparently SpaceX claiming that they will make their own laws when they get to Mars? So I don't know, maybe Nigel or Martin would like to address that.
Yes, I must admit, I can't get too excited about that at the moment, really. I think I do feel it's unlikely that many people will feel it worthwhile to go there. There are some ideas about mining the moon in a big way to get helium-3 and things of that kind, but these seem to be unlikely. And so I think as long as we can avoid space warfare, avoid a situation where different nations attack the other satellites and things like that, then that's the main concern. To actually worry about territorial rights on another planet or on the moon, I think is more futuristic and less important. But it is important to make sure that access to space is free and we don't spread warfare into space.
I agree. I think there's two things there on space, though. There is a degree of equality about using space in a benign way, particularly for remote sensing, communications, and so on, and not having large parts of the world unable to participate in that. But there is one other aspect, and I was looking it up while Martin was giving the talks, and that is the access to materials. I was just looking up some of the systems about some of the metals and so on we use in our technology, and the time scale they have for those running out. And this is driving, for example, a lot of the Chinese politics in Africa, for example.
Yes.
And that is why the ideas about asteroid mining or lunar mining do have some resonance. I mean, we can't just rape our own planet and go and rip up all the ocean floors just because we want some particular elements that happen to be down there. So I think that that's the area that we perhaps should think about. But then the space law comes into who gets them and then who sets the price.
Yes.
Charlie.
Thanks. Whilst these are, of course, very interesting questions, I do find them a dangerous distraction. And indeed, much of the talk that focused on the potential for technology in the future is, I think, a misprioritization of human efforts. As Martin has said, we face a critical emergency with climate change. In addition to this, we are destroying the natural world at quite unimaginable rates. And so by focusing on the technological future, we are ignoring the biophysical realities of the world we live in, our only home. And, we are in an emergency. Over 13,000 climate scientists have stated we are in an emergency. And in an emergency, we stop what we are doing and we focus urgently on the critical task at hand. And we are in a position now where the next 5-10 years will be the most critical there have ever been or will ever be in the history and future of humanity. If we do not arrest the climate crisis, then the world we're talking about in 2050 is a world of unimaginable suffering and death. Now, all these technologies we're talking about, they assume stability, whereas, there is no space exploration on a dead planet. And I think really, given the urgency of the situation, we need all hands on deck dealing with the matter at hand, and that is ensuring a planet in which humanity can survive and thrive.
I agree with that. Could I add a footnote, which is that in fact, to do all these things and to provide a good life for the 9 billion people on the planet in 2050, we need some new technology, but not much. We need redeployment of our existing resources. And the real indictment of the ethics of the world is that we allow these huge inequalities to exist, which could be cured. And I've had debates on this with Steven Pinker, whose books you may know. He's a great optimist and thinks the world's getting better in every respect. And the point I would make and have made to him is that it is true that the world is getting better in the sense of life expectancy, infant mortality, and literacy were all improving. But although it's true that things were more miserable in the Middle Ages than now, the gap between the way things are and the way they could be is not narrow. In the Middle Ages, it was pretty miserable, but there wasn't much they could do. Whereas now, we are indeed, as Pinker rightly says, better off than in the Middle Ages. But the gap between the way we are and the way we could be is much wider. Take one example, the richest 1,000 people in the world could double the income of the bottom billion. And extreme inequality like that, real sort of negations of any claim that we are improving ethically in a collective way.
Well, I'm afraid this session is coming to an end. We've run out of time. It is evident that people have been fired up. We have many, many, many questions we haven't addressed, and even more than one could think of. I think if humans engage as meaningfully with the issues confronting our species as we have seen today, we can be very hopeful, I hope, as well as concerned. I think there's a kind of bittersweet, hopeful but concerned message that comes from this session. Now, I'm sorry that we couldn't get to even a fraction of the questions. Watch out for an email from us highlighting some of the unanswered questions as for thought. And there will also be a link circulated to a YouTube video of this event. I also wish to draw everyone's attention to a host of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics events organized by the University of Kent as part of the Science Week, which starts on Monday. Now, I wish to thank you for connecting with us and thank Martin and the members of our expert panel for their valuable insights. Finally, there is a team of dedicated individuals who have been working very hard behind the scenes to publicize this event and to make all the technology work. So I want to mention Amy Jackson, Hannah Tonry, and Rachel Small for their superb efforts. And I also wish to thank the Kent School of Law for allowing us to use their Zoom webinar account. So stay safe, everyone, and see you next year. Take care.
Right. Thank you very much.